Hello, everyone. As you have been notified automatically, the meeting is being recorded. So I do want to say that after each presentation, there's going to be a 20-minute question answer period. And so if you want to speak out your questions or comments, if you have any, or put on your video, then that's wonderful. But I do want to let you know that that will be part of the recording. You're also able to put a question in the chat, and I'll be able to call on you that way, or just read out your question for you. Okay, so I'm just gonna wait a few more seconds here just to make sure that everybody who is coming is here. Okay, so sorry about that. All right, so welcome to the webinar series for the Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics. I am Amber and I'll be hosting today. Today's webinar is called Upon Moral and Genetic Stereotyping, and our two speakers today are Seth Goldwasser, presenting The Cure is Worse Than the Disease on the Concepts of Health and Disability, and Katherine Ward from Bucknell University, presenting Too Good for This World, Moral Bioenhancement, and the Ethics of Making Moral Misfits. So I just want to give a brief land acknowledgement. I am living in Guelph, Ontario, so I don't know where you guys are, but I will give the land acknowledgement for where I am. So I reside within the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is an agreement with the Hindo, Osno, Endi, and Anishinaabe. I'm so sorry about those terrible pronunciations, and their allied nations to live peaceably on the lands throughout what is now known as the Great Lakes region. So if, as I said, if anybody has any questions, make a little note of them while we listen to the presentations, and we can address those after each talk. So first up is Seth Goldwasser. So take it away, Seth.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you everyone, including Diane, for setting this up. And it's so wonderful to be here and to give a talk today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and can everyone see that? All right. Okay. So I have given this talk a few times before. I'm going to try to go through, I have like something written up and I have some slides, and I may stop every once in a while to point out more specifically what's going on in each slide. And yeah, I think that's everything. I'll just get started. So what difference is there, if any, between cautioning pregnant people against drinking alcohol to excess and cautioning prospective parents against selecting potential offspring that will develop a disability like deafness or Down syndrome? According to some self-evaluagenicists, there is none. It's permissible to use genetic counseling or genetic enhancement to select or treat potential offspring, provided that doing so doesn't decrease the offspring's chance of a good life or interfere with others' well-being. The purpose of this talk is to argue that blanket approval of the use of genetic counseling and genetic enhancement begs the question. Specifically, in approving the use of genetic counseling or genetic enhancement in the case of disability, eugenicists commit themselves to a view of human function or ability, and thereby what constitutes limits or deficits therein. But available accounts of human function that eugenicists may appeal to underdetermine for several disabilities whether those disabilities limit or decrease human function or ability. Disabilities like deafness or Down syndrome might constitute other ways of being rather than limits on or deficits in any human function or ability. We may fail to recognize this because the concepts of health and disease we inherit from ableist traditions in medicine impact our concept of disability, in which case there are morally relevant differences between some uses of genetic counseling or genetic enhancement and others that go unaccounted for. And these unaccounted for differences problematize blanket approval. So here's the structure of the talk. First, I'm going to focus on genetic counseling and present an argument for its permissibility that I take to be common ground for eugenicists. I then turn to consider the accounts of health that eugenicists can appeal to. Finally, I unpack why those accounts underdetermine whether certain disabilities limit or decrease human function or ability, and conclude by suggesting that to defend the use of genetic counseling, eugenicists must specify genuine limits on or decreases in human function or ability. I'll also mention briefly the impact this argument has for the abortion debate. So let's get started with part one. So I understand genetic counseling to be a broad set of practices involving two steps. First, genetic counselors use a variety of diagnostic tools to detect or infer genetic diseases and disorders, as well as abnormalities that might predict birth defects. In the second step, genetic counselors attempt to help individuals come to decisions on, for instance, whether to carry a pregnancy to term or to undergo a fetal procedure. My main contention is that harm is done to the disabled during the second step of this process in virtue of normative judgments made by both medical professionals and prospective parents concerning the limits on well-being imposed on the disabled or their community in virtue of their being disabled. So this is where I think harm stems from. So here's an argument for the permissibility of genetic counseling that I take to be common ground for eugenicists. And there's a parallel argument to be made in the case of genetic enhancement, which also depends on genetic enhancement being a two-step process. The only difference is that the harms involved in the application of normative judgments against selecting for disability occur in the transition from the first step to the second step, rather than just in the second step, as it is with counseling. So here's the argument. Genetic counseling for some potential offspring is prima facie permissible if the expected total well-being of the potential offspring or the expected total well-being of those who may be harmed by that offspring are not limited or decreased by its use. The expected total well-being of some potential offspring or the expected total well-being of those who may be harmed by that offspring are not limited or decreased by the elimination or treatment of disabilities that are or thought to be largely genetically determined. Genetic counseling can be used to eliminate or treat disabilities that are or thought to be largely genetically determined. And genetic counseling for some potential offspring, namely those suffering from a disability that is or is thought to be largely genetically determined, is therefore prima facie permissible. There are three things worth noting about this argument. First, like some eugenicists, I remain neutral, or as neutral as possible, on theories of well-being. So the argument, I think, applies whether we're committed to maximizing the experience of pleasure in the absence of pain, so hedonistic accounts, the satisfaction of desires, desire fulfillment accounts, or engaging in activities that are objectively good for us, objectivist accounts. Second, by, quote, expected total well-being, I mean the balance of pleasure and pain, opportunities for desire satisfaction, or opportunities for beneficial activities that predictably result from an intervention. Finally, the relevant sphere of causal influence isn't made explicit by, quote, those who may be harmed by that offspring. Nonetheless, I take it that at minimum, the well-being of caretakers and of those the offspring will form a local community with matters when deciding to use genetic counseling. So before moving on, some eugenicists think their focus on enhancement towards a good life in general, or quote, all-purpose goods, helps them avoid issues of health, disease, and disability. Still, they're committed to the claim that a person or those around that person lead better lives if that person isn't hampered by an in principle preventable or treatable state, which in virtue of its properties unnecessarily limits or decreases well-being. And eugenicists think it obvious that most disabilities, especially ones that are or thought to be largely genetically determined, are in principle preventable or treatable states of the disabled, which in virtue of their properties unnecessarily limit or decrease well-being. So in the third part of this talk, I attack this argument on the grounds that, quote, disability isn't well enough defined given available naturalist accounts of health. If so, then the use of genetic counseling isn't justified, at least in the relevant cases of disability. So let's turn to the naturalist accounts. So my view ends up being very close to Elizabeth Barnes' mere difference view. Well, it's a form of mere difference view, but it's different from her value neutral account, if I'm remembering the name of that correctly. It differs slightly, and we can talk about that in Q&A, but I just want to flag that I'm aware of her work and drawing from it in this talk as well. So pathology and health are interdependent concepts. Both inside and outside of medicine and bioethics, we understand pathology at least as a loss of health and health as absence of pathology. The two most prominent naturalist accounts suggest that the concepts of pathology and health are connected by the concept of function, specifically the presence or absence of possibly harmful functional deficits. Eugenicists must appeal to naturalist accounts or hybrid accounts. Naturalist accounts hold that health and pathology are or supervene on biological facts. Hybrid accounts have one condition, at least one condition, that grounds health and pathology on biological facts. By contrast, fully non-naturalist accounts, often called normativist accounts, hold that health and pathology supervene on judgments that some state is a good or bad state to be in, respectively. By claiming that certain states internal to the organism unnecessarily limit or decrease well-being by imposing limits on or deficits in function or ability, eugenicists commit themselves to the reality of the limits or deficits imposed irrespective of judgment. Otherwise, the eugenicist project could be carried out simply by judging that any state is a good state to be in. So this further commitment automatically precludes appealing to fully normativist accounts of health. So turning to the naturalist account, the first of the two that I'm going to be talking about today is Bors's biostatistical account. So here we have the 4 conditions on health that Bors lays out in his account. So according to Bors, health is the absence of pathology, and pathology is any limit on or deficit in species-typical functioning of any part of an organism. Species-typical functions are those activities of parts of organisms which, if they do anything at all, contribute to the survival or reproduction of individual members of a reference class, in this case, a species. So the account is biostatistical because it claims that the activity types that are functional are those that are statistically typical of the reference class in terms of mechanisms of contribution, rates of performance, and timing. So for example, to take the most often cited example, the function of the heart is to pump blood because it's doing so, if it does anything at all, contributes to the survival or reproduction of individual human beings. And because it's doing so in those individuals, including how, at what rate, and when, is statistically typical for the species. So Bors's view has a couple of problems. For instance, it follows trivially from his view that nearly everyone is in a state of pathology most of the time. Bors readily acknowledges this fact and argues on the basis of it that we should not conflate pathology with illness, where illness is normatively loaded and pathology is not. And only illnesses are the sorts of things that require clinical intervention. I think later on he changes the terminology a bit, but the point remains. Most important for our purposes, though, is Bors's view is such that it requires specifying a reference class. So we can't determine what's typical for an individual without some class with which to compare that individual. Above, I simply assumed species as a reference class, but this assumption won't take us very far. Species concepts are notoriously difficult to define. Moreover, Bors himself qualifies his view to capture relevant differences within species. For instance, sexual polymorphisms and other polymorphisms like blood type and distinct life stages. For instance, so to draw an example, the typical heart rate, active heart rate of an elderly male member of a species is often atypical for a young female member. But as some philosophers have pointed out, Bourse never gives a principled justification for the restriction of intraspecies reference classes to just sex and life stage and the relevant polymorphisms that he appeals to in his papers. This, combined with his commitment to a fully naturalist account of health, leaves open whether states like deafness or Down syndrome should be thought of as pathological or as constituting distinct reference classes. In the latter case, the deaf and those with Down syndrome may not be in a pathological state to begin with. So moving on, the second naturalist account of health is Jerome Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account. So according to it, health is the absence of pathology, and pathology is a deficit in function that's harmful to the organism. And dysfunction is again understood as a limit or decrease in function, and harm is understood as a negative impact on the person's well-being according to the relevant standards. Functions are in turn defined as those activities of parts of organisms that contributed to the survival or reproduction of ancestors of those organisms, such that the relevant parts were selected for by natural selection. So Wakefield is appealing to an etiological or selected effects account of function. Again, the function of the heart is to pump blood, but on Wakefield's account, this is because pumping blood contributed to past survival or reproduction, such that the heart was selected for. So Wakefield combines a fully naturalist etiological account of function with a normative condition stating that the dysfunction in question must be harmful to the organism to count as pathological. This means that Wakefield's view avoids the counterintuitive conclusion of Bourse's that any limit or deficit in the function of any part of an organism amounts to a pathology. Wakefield can therefore say that any pathology warrants intervention, unlike Bourse. But there's a gap in Wakefield's view, much like the gap in Bourse's view. More specifically, etiological accounts don't state exactly how far in the past a part must be selected for in order for its activity to count as a function. At least one proponent of the etiological account, Karen Neander, suggests that normal functioning can often be ascribed to a part over a few generations. In the same paper that she writes with Rosenberg, she claims that we can determine a part's function by tracing an unbroken lineage of organisms under continuous selection pressure for that part, due in part to the contribution that activity makes to the ancestors of the organism in question. So selection pressures are features extrinsic to organisms that contribute to the differential inheritance of some traits over others. Selection pressures may be at least partially socially determined. The inability to digest lactose, for instance, in some human populations is dysfunctional because the selection pressure for digesting lactose after infancy was continuously enforced only among those populations through domestication practices. So even if lactose intolerance constitutes a harm to much of the species, on Wakefield's view, it's not a pathology for those of us for whom there was no selection for lactose digestion past infancy. So it's only a pathology for those populations for whom their ancestors were engaged in the domestication practices that constituted a selection pressure for lactose digestion after infancy. Analogously, assuming once present selection pressures are absent for long enough, some disabilities may cease being pathological on etiological-based accounts of health. One benefit of the amount of niche construction humans can engage in is that the world can be made to require less, say, audition, vision, or ambulation. If so, then selection pressures against deafness, blindness, or the inability to ambulate could be alleviated, in which case, given enough time, the corresponding disabilities would cease being pathological on Wakefield's and other etiological-based accounts. So with both accounts of health in play, I turn to what's wrong with the eugenicist arguments for the permissibility of genetic counseling. So far I've presented an argument that I take to be common ground for eugenicists defending the use of genetic counseling, as well as two prominent naturalist/hybrid accounts of health. The argument I presented in part 1 claimed that it's permissible to use genetic counseling when doing so wouldn't limit or decrease expected total well-being. I now want to suggest that this argument fails because, quote, disability fails to mark a well-defined category. As a result, some interventions brought by genetic counseling may threaten to limit or decrease expected total well-being. So we've seen that certain disabilities may fail to count as pathologies on the biostatistical and etiological based accounts. On the biostatistical account, you'll recall the relevant disabilities count as pathologies only if, only if the disabled aren't considered their own reference class. Because Bourse doesn't give a principled reason for reference class restrictions, there's no reason against counting the deaf or those with Down syndrome as their own reference classes. On etiological-based accounts, by contrast, there's no reason, disabilities count as pathologies only if the relevant selection pressures continue to select for the relevant able-bodied trait or activity. But because etiological accounts allow for change in function as a function of sustained change in selection pressures, it's open to us to give reasons favoring niche construction towards a more deaf or Down syndrome friendly world. We can more or less diffuse Wakefield's account by refusing to judge that the state is one that negatively impacts a person's well-being, right? We can change the standards and engage in niche construction that allows us to avoid claiming that these disabilities are pathological on Wakefield's account. So that disabilities may cease to be pathologies on both of the accounts that I take it eugenicists are willing to appeal to, or the ones that are most viable for them. This threatens to undermine the argument given in part 1 on behalf of eugenicists. So this is the argument again. More specifically, it threatens premises 2 and 3 of that argument by suggesting that there are morally relevant differences between certain disabilities, such that their being genetically determined and possibly harmful doesn't determine whether we're justified in using genetic counseling to intervene on them. Indeed, it may turn out that expected total well-being is always limited or decreased more by failures to recognize some disabled communities as constituting their own reference class, or by failures to construct disability-friendly environments. If so, this raises 2 questions. First, why think that the permissibility of intervening on, for instance, fetal alcohol syndrome or Tay-Sachs extends to intervening on disabilities that are thought to be largely genetically determined, like all such disabilities? Second, why does it matter if my opponents think that eugenic practices are justified when addressing non-pathological states? So answering both of these questions brings us back to part 1. I take it eugenicists take for granted that continuous with pathologies, disabilities limit or decrease well-being by imposing limits on or deficits in human function or ability. As such, eugenicists take for granted that addressing disability is a matter of correcting limits or deficits on function or ability through clinical intervention. So as an answer to the first question, if disabilities are members of a natural kind, then what applies to some member in virtue of being a member of that kind applies to all members. So if Tay-Sachs and FAS, deafness and Down syndrome are all members of the same harmful natural kind, then we're justified in acting against deafness and Down syndrome for the very same reason we're justified in acting against Tay-Sachs or FAS. As an answer to the second question, if deafness and Down syndrome are of the same kind as FAS and Tay-Sachs by being limits on or deficits in human function or ability, then intervening on deafness or Down syndrome is a victimless crime for the same reason that treating FAS and Tay-Sachs is a victimless crime, for the very same reason that enhancing vision or audition to increase the visual or audible spectrum, respectively, is a victimless crime, right? All of these end up collapsing into all-purpose goods. But eugenicists are wrong to think that intervening on deafness or Down syndrome is in fact a victimless crime. So my suggestion is if there are gaps, right, in the accounts of health, that they leave open whether the disabled constitute other ways of being human through constituting their own reference classes or having unique selection pressures. If so, then it's not the case that for all such disabilities, successfully intervening on them leads to the satisfaction of norms of able-bodied health. If so, then there are some such disabilities such that norms specific to those disabilities constitute health for individuals with them, and intervening on those individuals such that they fail to satisfy the norms of disabled health limits or decreases their expected total well-being. So then there are some, given this set of conditionals and the fact that I take myself, at least, to have shown the antecedent of the first conditional, if would follow, the consequent of the last conditional would follow through a series of inferences of the form of modus ponens. So there are some such disabilities such that norms specific to those disabilities constitute health for individuals with those disabilities, and intervening on them such that they fail to satisfy the norms specific to those disabilities limits or decreases their expected total well-being. So to further highlight this point, consider intervening on potential offspring along ethnic or cultural lines. No matter the impact on individual well-being, and put that aside for a moment, it's clear that our interventions wouldn't be without victims. We'd be threatening to destroy an ethnicity or culture. We'd be, in effect, destroying a history of traditions. By their own lights, eugenicists should think this impermissible. Some don't, but I think they should. But it's here that the distinction between disability and other social categories comes to the fore. That is, eugenicists claim that the disabled aren't discriminated against through genetic counseling, but racial groups, by, for instance, selecting for whiter offspring, might well be. The former is thought of as an obvious limit or decrease in well-being by being a limit on or deficit in human function or ability, where the latter isn't thought of as such. But again, the accounts to which eugenicists can appeal, the accounts of health to which eugenicists can appeal, should give us pause about whether disabilities are pathological, and thus whether they entail limits on or deficits in human function or abilities. The problem isn't just that we have difficulty placing disability within the categories of health and disease. Rather, it's that our concepts of health and disease haven't been developed in a way that's morally neutral towards the concept of disability. As a result, there's an overextension of the jurisdiction of the clinical to disparate chronic conditions such that all of them fall under the umbrella of disability. Continuous with pathology, disabilities are then thought to impose some limits on or deficits in human function or ability that eugenic practices might alleviate. This thought leads genetic counselors to make harmful normative judgments when counseling their patients against selecting for the disabled. Acknowledging the overextension should help us acknowledge heterogeneity among disabilities, in which case we can't simply give blanket approval of the use of clinical interventions, including genetic counseling, on the potentially disabled. So before concluding, I want to stress that the argument I'm giving the argument that I'm giving that rejects blanket approval of the use of clinical intervention towards selecting against the disabled is consistent with a duty to maintain wide access to abortion. So the argument I made thus far implores us to change our clinical and conceptual practices surrounding the treatment of the disabled, but it doesn't require us to change our legal practices quite yet. Indeed, part of the project of removing stigma from disability, of eliminating harmful normative judgments towards the disabled, which is, I think, where the problem is located. Part of that project is achieving equity with respect to normatively loaded conceptions of what it means to be disabled and able-bodied. If so, then if it's morally permissible, as I believe it is, to abort fetuses that would develop into able-bodied people, then all else being equal, it's likewise morally permissible to abort fetuses that would develop into disabled people, so long as doing so is backed by a practical judgment that does not involve or depend on conceiving of the latter as pitiable or to be avoided or to be corrected or to be destroyed or to be rectified in some way. And if it's morally permissible to abort in both cases, then any legal restriction on access to abortion restricts individual autonomy, thereby violating a right and duty we have to prospective parents to be able to plan their lives. We therefore have a duty to maintain access to abortion and at the same time to rectify the oppression of the disabled through attempting to change normative judgments that medical professionals make towards selecting against disability. So to conclude, eugenicists take for granted that improvements in human function and ability are intrinsic goods. They also take for granted that certain clinical interventions amount to improvements in human function or ability. I've argued that we should be wary of this second claim. It might be that deafness or Down syndrome is another way of being human rather than a limit on or deficit in human function or ability. We may fail to see this because the concepts of health and disease that we inherit from ableist traditions in medicine impact our concept of disability. If so, current concepts of health and disease are ill-equipped to distinguish disability from non-disability or disability from pathology. At the very least, then, we need some further argument why deafness or Down syndrome are closer in kind to FAS or Tay-Sachs than, say, being Black or Jewish. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. That was great. So I see that there are a few questions already. The first question is from Philip, and he's put it there in the chat, but I'll just read it out really quickly. So he's asking, are the criteria for determining genetic well-being requisite for a good life? If not, does genetic counseling have a raison d'etre?
So if I understand the question correctly, I'm just gonna actually write this down and try to keep track of the questions so I can get back to them when I go back to writing.
It's fair enough.
Determining genetic well-being requisite for. So actually, I'm not exactly sure I'm tracking the first part of the question. So is the question, are the criteria for well-being which depend on genetic facts? Oh, thank you so much. On the facts, sorry. Do the criteria for determining well-being include as a subset criteria that are specific to the genetic makeup of the person? Is that sort of the question?
So Philip has replied there. Yeah, he says, what are the criteria for determining well-being and genetic counseling? And is any of them requisite for a good life? Right.
So I want to say that yeah, so I want to say that it really depends on the specific condition that we're talking about. So one criteria you might have for well-being that depends on one's genetic profile, maybe genomic well-being, is not living a short, painful life, right? And sorry, how is this connected to genetic profiles? Well, you might think that there's a causal connection, right? One's genetic profile is such that if their genes were to be expressed, then they would live a short and painful life. So I'm thinking of the case of Tay-Sachs. So that seems to be a criterion for well-being that depends on genetic profiling, or on one's genetic profile. And it does seem that trying to eliminate or treat that genetic profile is part of securing for that potential person quote good life, right? Or maybe a good life, one necessary condition on a good life is that it's not painful and short. So I'm willing to grant that genetic counseling has going forward. It is a way of clinically intervening that can be justified. Part of what I'm trying to do in the paper is say that it's been given too much power. It's been given too much to preside over in terms of the conditions that are under its purview, and that we should maybe restrict its domain somewhat. And I haven't really I've been given principles for that restriction, but I'm sort of gesturing at those principles by saying there are at least some disabilities such that treating them is overextending that jurisdiction.
Thank you, Seth. Yeah, I see that you've noticed Philip has replied with a follow-up question, which is, can't a short, painful life be a good life? So what do you say to that?
So, yeah, I guess it depends on how we're defining short and how we're defining painful. I take, Mozart and Poe both made it to maturity. They both became adults. I think, I'm not, again, with medical stuff, with the empirical stuff, it's really hard to sort of give principles from the armchair. But I do want to say that, and I think for this reason, it's easier to point to paradigmatic examples. So I'm very tempted to just say, the person who suffers Tay-Sachs by dying before 2 or 3, that's too short, and the pain that they experience is sufficient to warrant intervention. Sure, if someone wants to say that Mozart and Poe's life were short and painful, then I think I'd have to respond by further specifying what I mean by short and painful, and maybe adding subscripts or something like that in order to, differentiate. I mean, like extremely short and extremely painful or something like that.
That's fair. Thank you. Gennady has a question.
Hello, thank you very much for an excellent talk. So I was wondering, someone might say, for instance, that a reason to sort of undergo this genetic pre-selection might be that being disabled, just as a fact, means that you're going to live a worse life, generally speaking, than somebody who isn't someone who isn't disabled. And someone might say that the reason for that is not so much that to do with say functional factors, right? Someone might say that there are going to be social factors. And as parents, we generally might want the best possible life for our children. So my question is, do you have a response to that particular argument? Or would something like that, the genetic selection for the sake of living a generally speaking better life than non-disabled people, would something like that sort of I guess evade your argument? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that argument, or for that question. Sorry. Yeah. So part of the project is to sort of land the eugenicist in something like a dilemma. It's implicit at this point, but the idea is you could try to go the social route, right? So here's your dilemma. If you try to go the functional route, I've shown that there's this lacuna, right? That is such that you haven't filled it, and getting blanket approval, getting approval for the use of these interventions would require you to fill it, and you haven't. The other horn of the dilemma is you can go the social route. So you can leave the functional route behind. But then I think, and it's implicit that there are various choice points along the way where I can say, well, if the issue is the judgment about such and such being a bad state to be in, then the best way of accomplishing the eugenicist project is just to say that whatever states we thought of as not being good birth are good birth, right? And then that social change would be sufficient for getting what the eugenicist wants. But I take it, right, that the eugenicist is not going to want to impale themselves on that horn. There are various sorts of ways of constructing that horn. The one that I just said, just sort of judging that the relevant states are actually good states to be in is one way. Another would be simply demanding that, if you want to be more realistic about the social impacts of living a disabled life, I think the sort of response I give to Wakefield's argument provides me some material here as well in saying it doesn't justify genetic, that fact that the individuals may be going to have a worse life due to social factors is not justification for genetic counseling or any such clinical interventions specifically, right? It justifies, I think justifies instead changing the social landscape, including, making the world just more accessible to people with those disabilities, rather than, trying to correct for the disability by acting on the disability and getting rid of it.
Yeah, Gennady, you have a follow-up question? I don't know if you're aware, but if you're speaking, you're muted still.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. It said that I couldn't unmute. Okay, so I guess my follow-up question, and I'm just pushing a little bit on this, because at least from my perspective and from a consequentialist position, we might say, we can either reorganize society so that disabled people aren't discriminated against, or on the other hand, we might undergo some sort of genetic counseling or genetic selection. So I'm pushing that on that a little bit because one might argue that in terms of just pain and pleasure, they could end up being the same. In fact, it's possible that genetic counseling might end up being more effective. So I don't know. So I'm sure there's a good argument for your position. I'm just curious as to how exactly you might deliver that, because once again, just in terms of sort of pain and pleasure, they look very similar. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely something that dogs me a little bit. And I think one of the main reasons why I appeal to the analogy to social categories like Blackness or being Jewish. So you might, I think part of the problem for eugenicists and for the clinical practitioners is that it seems to them very much like you could go either way, right? And it may turn out that you avoid a lot of suffering with genetic counseling and enhancement that you don't avoid in changing the social situation, right? A lot of these disabilities do come with them, chronic pain and the like. So my sort of response, my defense of this argument is going to take the form of, for these disabilities, and specifically for disabilities like deafness, Down syndrome, blindness, and the like, there is the benefit of the pleasure of having a culture, right, that you engage with and share, and that is available for people who are not part of that culture to appreciate and support. And you get rid of a whole category of goods through the genetic interventions that you don't get rid of by changing the social situation. And I think if I'm willing to go along with the consequentialist that far, I'm sort of willing to say, it's my thought that the calculus will come out in favor of my position in virtue of saving those other goods.
Thank you so much, Seth. So I'm going to move on to some questions that we have here in the chat. Raymond has asked, how have you found service providers like genetic counselors respond to your arguments? Do they respond well to your arguments? And what is a good way to engage with them to share these important findings?
So unfortunately, I haven't been able to get a hold of medical professionals to sort of assess, to get their responses. Oh, sorry, my dogs are barking. I haven't really been able to get in touch with any medical professionals to share with them this argument and see what they think. I really love to. I'd really love to see, how they respond to it. If there's maybe, I think, a way of engaging with them that's good to share this sort of thing, I wouldn't point to my paper. I would say, like, my paper is mostly for philosophers. I would point them to things like the recently published book Disability Visibility. I would point to works that disabled philosophers have written, like Shelley Tremaine or Elizabeth Barnes. And mostly I'd ask them to, take very seriously the lived experiences of their patients and listen to what their patients have to say. And if they don't, if their patients don't include adult disabled people, they should go find those people and ask them, what it means for them to live that sort of life and what they find meaningful and, the sort of thing that they would want. That sort of information is readily available. It's out there. And I would just try to point people in that direction. But yeah, if anyone knows any medical professionals that I could share this argument with, I'd love to get their feedback.
Thank you. So Sandra has asked, is it problematic to use pain for the criteria for determining a good life? That pain is a very subjective thing. So many people who have disabilities are willing to live with physical and psychological discomfort that would lead me to request MAID. So so is it problematic then to use pain in this way?
So I actually don't, sorry, I'm betraying my ignorance. So what is MAID?
It's a question for you, Sandra.
Medical assistance in dying. Okay, sorry, quick Google, got it.
That's okay.
Yeah, so part of my argument, part of what I'm doing in the argument too, is I'm trying to target these, and I probably need to precify this if I continue to write on it. So I need to precify why I'm focusing on interventions on potentially disabled people rather than actually disabled people. Not that in many cases doing so is okay, but rather that I want to leave open cases in which a disabled person chooses of their own volition to undergo some intervention that would, basically render them among the able-bodied, relevant, or puts them as close to that reference class as possible. Or, alternatively, going in for MAID. I want to leave it open that adult disabled people can make those decisions for themselves and that it's permissible to do so. I think by sourcing the harm and normative judgments against selecting for disability, I open myself up to the criticism that I don't necessarily give myself that maneuvering. But if I restrict, which I hope I can further flesh this out, if I restrict to the judgments that are made in the process of gestation, then I think I can avoid those worries. I can just say, my focus is just on these interventions at this point, not adults making decisions about their own bodies.
Thank you. Sandra, if you do have a follow-up question, then feel free to post it in the chat there. Until we hear from Sandra, if she has something else that she'd like to say, I'll move on to Anna's question. So Anna is saying, Seth, thank you so much for this excellent talk. What happens when categories like disability are collapsed into Blackness or Jewishness and vice versa? You are disabled because you are Black, and you are Black because you are disabled. How does genetic pre-selection become challenged if we take this seriously?
Right. So I think his name is Jonathan Harris, has written a couple books that actually takes this view seriously. So he says, look, eugenics is great. It's applicable in all these different sorts of cases. And, in fact, let's consider a case where like the ozone depletes and it would be better for everyone to have more melanin in their skin, right? Then genetic enhancement towards non-whiteness might actually be permissible because, we're helping people avoid skin cancer, presumably. And I say, in the paper, I just say, I think this sort of selecting for racial types, I guess, or for skin color. I mean, he's specific about skin color, and I think this sort of dodges the issue of race entirely because it focuses solely on skin color. Through like a very mechanistic sort of explanation. And so I think, I don't like that example at all. I think it misses the point. The racial category, right, is what I care about. And in the case of a marginalized racial category, I think you can't get all the way to selecting against the marginalized racial category, the marginalized ethnic category, without introducing serious harms. So I'm willing to, at this point, claim in response to that the harms induced by selecting against one social category are the same sorts of harms induced by selecting against the other. So I just don't think either are permissible. If someone could give me an argument for their permissibility, I think the sort of thing that maybe, was it Raymond? No, it wasn't Raymond. I don't think I'm gonna pronounce your name correctly. Gennady? The sort of thing that—
Gennady was
Gennady.
yeah.
Sorry about that. The sort of argument or the sort of concern he was raising is connected in as much as if you are a consequentialist, you could claim, I mean, this would be an empirical claim, that in fact genetic enhancement or genetic counseling selecting against the social categories promotes the best outcomes. I seriously doubt that. I think the benefits that we get through the maintenance of distinct cultures far outstrips the benefits we get from selecting against racial categories and I think disabilities. I have yet to sort of figure out exactly how I want to block the move to even considering those empirical claims, because I'd very much like a stronger argument to say it's wrong to even make those comparisons. But at this point, the argument is just medical professionals and prospective parents and eugenicists have all sort of failed to recognize this category of values that attach to the disabled. And in doing that, they seriously harm the disabled. And so we should really countenance that category. I think I need further argument to show that countenancing that category just makes it wrong in all cases to select for any social group that has that category of value.
Thank you. That's fair enough. It looks like we have about 3 minutes left to our question and answer period here. So if there are any other questions, then please feel free to raise your hand or type them out in the chat while we wait to hear from you. Yeah, Gennady.
Hello. So I had a question here, and I noticed you used the term "the disabled." I'm curious if there's any particular reason, because I know that there are other ways of sort of talking about disabled people. For instance, disabled people or people with disabilities. I'm curious as to what motivated your choice.
I think I wanted to remain mostly neutral between person first and non-person first language, but yeah, of the two, I'm much more inclined to say disabled people than people with disabilities. And yeah, I mean, if it comes, I'm very happy to like change the language in the paper and the talk to better fit that practice.
Thank you. Okay, we've got enough time, Sandra. Go ahead.
My question perhaps is a little bit out of place, but I'm interested in your reaction to the notion that if genetic counseling is for parents to help them make this decision, and they will presumably make the decision based on the values that they have that contribute to their understanding of the good life, what contribution do you think philosophers have to make to this discussion? I mean, we have gotten in place laws that make abortion permissible. So don't you really only have in this circumstance that background law and the values of the parents?
Thank you so much for that question. So I sort of want to say that it enters in two places. One is in informing the values of the parents, I mean, future parents, presumably. I don't know that there's much that can be done at this point with the current prospective parents, but the idea sort of is to introduce this different way of thinking of what disability means, and if that can be widely adopted by the culture, then individual parents will come to the table with a different set of values to begin with. And so that's one very lofty sort of goal of making an argument like this. The second place it would be pertinent would be in the actual, in the counseling in the medical professional's office, right? So even if the parent comes in with specific values, if we've trained medical professionals to recognize this category of value, they will be less willing to suggest certain interventions than others. I think getting the medical, so it is actually less lofty / ambitious than the first, but the idea is to get medical professionals to recognize this value and to act in accordance with that recognition. It may not change the, it may not result in every case where it would have been better to not select against the disabled child. It may not result in not selecting against that child, right? But it would be better if, in general, that were the case, or at least we increase the likelihood that in cases where it would be better to not select against the disabled child, there was actually not any selection against the disabled child. And I think, the way that counselors play a role there can be informed by this sort of argument. And then the loftier goal is to just change the whole culture's attitude towards being disabled so that there's not this sort of harmful selection against.
Great. Thank you so much, Seth. So time is up. I hope everybody is joining in with me in saying thank you so much for giving this talk. It was excellent. Really appreciated that insight. And I'd like now to welcome our next speaker, Katherine Ward, who is presenting on something called Too Good for This World, Moral Bioenhancement and the Ethics of Making Moral Misfits. So thank you, Katherine. You can take it away.
Hi, and I want to thank the conference organizers for this opportunity. I'm very excited, and I'm very glad that I got to listen to Seth's excellent project. That was really interesting and food for thought. So the paper that I'm presenting on is about moral bioenhancement. So the use of biomedical interventions to enhance us, not cognitively, but enhance us morally, make us more moral in our interactions with the world. And what I do in this paper is I present one worry that I have about moral bioenhancements and a potential guardrail that should be in place if and when these kinds of moral bioenhancements begin developing in earnest. I draw on the concept of misfitting from disability studies to develop this worry. And I apply it to the moral context. I think about a sense in which there might be moral misfitting and moral misfitting that results in moral injury when there's a big misfit between who we are morally and our kinds of moral goals and our ability to execute those kind of moral ambitions. So that's kind of the basics of the paper. I open with a few thoughts that help situate the project and give some transparency to how I'm thinking about it. So that's where I'll start. Today, we encourage children to empathize with animals and other people. A child growing up in the United States will almost certainly have at least one beloved stuffed animal. Children's books feature anthropomorphized cats, bears, and rabbits that teach them to pay attention to and sympathize deeply with the feelings and needs of others. Kids are sad when no one wants Corduroy the bear, relieved when Peter Rabbit evades capture, and deeply troubled by the death of Bambi's mother. Children are primed to love and care about others. And by the age of 1, they are already highly empathic. Children as young as 14 months react to a stranger's pinched finger or stubbed toe with furrowed brows, looks of concern, and attempts to comfort. Although just starting to toddle, a child's early months have been full of moral training and moral learning. These lessons wouldn't take if there were no disposition or capacity for morally salient impulses and emotions. But those in rearing relationships to an infant or child are responsible for nurturing, stifling, and shaping moral inclinations and sensitivities. It is one of the joys and terrors of being a parent or caregiver. But consider dropping a modern toddler primed for empathy into medieval England. A child who is 2 would be deemed too young to hang for theft, but he or she might witness the hanging of an older child for such an infraction. Children as young as 7 were fair game for execution. Even if they didn't see the act of execution itself, they would certainly see its results. Steven Pinker notes that corpses broken on the wheel, hanging from gibbets or rotting in iron cages where the sinner had been left to die of exposure and starvation were a common part of the landscape. Our toddler would witness bear baiting, in which dogs attack a bear tied to a stake until the bear kills the dogs or collapses, and also the regular entertainment of nailing a cat to a post to headbutt it to death. For a child concerned about the stubbed toe of a stranger who reads stories that feature animal protagonists and who has learned to empathize and find morally considerable people and animals, witnessing this would be highly distressing, and being unable to intervene or ebb the flow of these overwhelming harms to others would be unbearable. Medieval men, wrote historian Mark Bloch, had little control over their immediate impulses. They were emotionally insensitive to the spectacle of pain, and they had small regard for human life. A 21st century toddler is not like this. These horrors would cut deep and hit emotional targets enlarged by their moral education. Perhaps our toddler would eventually acclimate to everyday moral horrors in the feudal world, but if they didn't, each day would be, to borrow a phrase from Dorothy Parker, a fresh hell. They would experience too much empathy for animals, feel too much compassion for other humans, and be too averse to violence to stomach everyday medieval brutality. And they would be powerless to escape or stop it. So this is kind of my background thought and what attracted me to this project and this worry. Persson and Savulescu have argued that moral bioenhancement is not only morally permissible, in some cases it is morally obligatory. Their argument has sparked heated debates on freedom and moral agency, personal identity, and moral perfectionism. Recently, a philosopher, Fabiano, has argued for a robust safety framework to steel the development of moral bioenhancement. However, his framework misses an important danger that concerns the moral permissibility of enhancing others into a misfit with their moral environment. In this paper, I caution against forms of moral bioenhancement that bring a moral agent into enough of a moral misfit with their environment to create moral injury, and specifically the moral injury of moral disempowerment. And I'll define that a little later. Such enhancements would be akin to transporting a modern toddler to medieval England, at least in terms of moral damage. I'll start by discussing moral bioenhancement and its appeal generally, so why it might be a good thing. I identify a particular form of moral bioenhancement that I think is morally impermissible by drawing on the disability concept of misfitting and the notion of moral injury. But I don't argue that moral bioenhancement in general is immoral. I agree that some forms are desirable and perhaps even morally required. My argument is quite modest. It's that a particular form of bioenhancement is morally impermissible and should be recognized as a constraint on moral bioenhancement. This constraint should be part of any framework steering the development of moral bioenhancement. But one important upshot of my argument is that this moral framework involving misfitting wouldn't just constrain moral bioenhancement. It might restrict the kinds of traditional moral enhancements that would be permissible, which is it would lead to some unintuitive results. So I'm interested in the future in exploring those. But first I want to talk about why I think it's plausible that moral bioenhancement might be needed. So I'll talk about what it is and why we might need it. Moral training is part of our socialization, and it occurs most clearly and powerfully, but not exclusively, in our early years. What I call traditional moral enhancements, they happen through explicit lessons about what's right and wrong. So reflection on past moral behavior, observation of others, explicit moral teaching. Persson and Savulescu point out the limits of traditional moral enhancement, which have been far less effective than traditional cognitive enhancements. For example, merely passing down knowledge generationally has enabled continuous and steady advances in math and science, so that, quote, the best mathematicians today are capable of figuring out solutions to mathematical problems that Euclid could not have dreamed of, end quote. Although we might think ourselves more morally evolved than the average medieval Englander, our cognitive achievements have far outstripped our moral ones, resulting in a dangerous mismatch between what our cognitive powers allow us to do in the world and our moral sensitivities regarding the effects of those actions. Technological advances resulting from traditional cognitive enhancements have enabled humans to create substantial changes over a progressively larger area of Earth, affecting other humans and non-human animals to a greater degree and in greater number. Current technologies allow small groups to kill thousands, perhaps millions, and our current manner of living is creating environmental degradation and mass human suffering that will only increase in the future. Yet, as Persson and Savulescu note, our moral psychology seems best suited to life in small, close-knit communities, to the intimate and immediate environment over which more primitive technology would have held sway. For this holdover moral psychology, the death of thousands in the abstract is harder to make sense of and feel the moral weight of than seeing one person suffering before our eyes. The knowledge of our impact on the environment and its effects, especially in the long term, has proven a poor motivator for large-scale change. And this is, at least in part, because of a similar short-term bias in our moral psychology. As Fabiano succinctly puts it, our present moral traits are unable to provide the level of large-scale cooperation necessary to deal with risks such as nuclear proliferation, drastic climate change, and pandemics, end quote. Although our cognitive development has enabled an ever-increasing influence over the world and into the future, the reach of our moral sensitivities remains small, focused on what we can see and interact with in the near future. Parsan and Savulescu worry that human beings are not by nature equipped with a moral psychology that empowers them to cope with the moral problems that these new conditions of life create. And cognitive enhancements, especially with effective biomedical interventions, will not only widen the gap between will only widen the gap between cognitive and moral capabilities. One possible solution, according to them, is to use moral bioenhancement to bring our moral and cognitive abilities into better alignment, so that we might wield our great cognitive powers with greater moral attunement and responsibility. Our core moral dispositions toward reciprocity, altruism, remorse, feelings of guilt, etc., might be enhanced rapidly and dramatically by biomedical intervention. If this is right, then we have a moral obligation to pursue those enhancements. Anyway, that's their argument. And to be clear, the enhancements that Parsan and Savulescu recommend are aimed at improving our ability to act morally, to boost our moral motivation so we might better follow through on our explicit moral commitments. Knowing what we ought to do is often trumped in the heat of action by other considerations. So the idea is that biomedical interventions via drugs or genetic engineering might allow us to tweak the genetic and neurobiological basis of our behavior, altering our sensitivity to moral features of situations, and increasing or decreasing the intensity of our emotional response to those features, thus making us less acratic. So my worry centers around how permissible it is for us to engage in this in certain contexts. And I draw on Rosemary Garland Thompson's view of disability as a kind of misfitting between person and environment. It seems plausible that there are certain kinds of often modest moral bioenhancements that would be permissible and perhaps even morally required. Some researchers provide strong evidence that in a laboratory setting, propranolol reduces implicit racial bias in users. One can readily imagine contexts, for example, in an HR department, in which the use of propranolol might be permissible and morally required. However, there is a limit to what is morally permissible when it comes to moral bioenhancement in general. It is, I'll argue, impermissible to perform, request, or require moral bioenhancements that would result in moral injury. And I'll show that a form of moral injury, moral bioenhancement, can be linked to misfit between moral agent and moral environment, and that certain forms of moral bioenhancement can predictably lead to these kinds of misfits. So I'll argue that the framework of moral misfitting is a useful heuristic for determining the permissibility of a given moral enhancement. But I think I should start with the concept of misfitting as developed by Rosemary Garland Thompson. Because she's proposed that there's an understanding of disability as a misfit between body and environment, so that able-bodied people often encounter sustaining environments. There are accessible public spaces, easy-to-use tools, serviceable communication devices, etc. In cases like this, the body and environment come together as a fit. There is harmony in which the body is extended to do certain things and the environment supports those doings. However, one's body can also encounter resistance and discord in an environment. It can encounter a misfit. And in these cases, one's doings are interrupted. These misfits between body and environment result in a range of things from annoyance to frustration to pain, and possibly political harm, certainly political harm. Fit and misfit, though, do not inhere either in the body or environment, but in the encounter between the two. It's a relation that is changing and dynamic. Garland says, in Garland Thompson says, in one moment and place, there's a fit, and in another moment, there might be a misfit. Jonathan Mooney has written about the stark difference between the cookie cutter learning environment of his primary education and his experiences in higher education. So he wrote that in middle school, his learning disabilities and attention deficit disorder were pathologized. The demand that he sit still and be quiet for long stretches of passive learning and lecture were impossible. He couldn't do the things being asked of him in that environment and with those tools. Mooney eventually graduated from Brown with an honors degree in English literature. According to Mooney, what enabled that achievement, and that seemed impossible in his early years, was the way in which his college environment accommodated and extended him. He says, "What disabled me were limitations not in myself, but in the environment. The passive learning experience where students sit at a desk most of the day, a narrow definition of intelligence conflated with reading and other right brain skills, and a medicalization of differences that reduce my brain to a set of deficits and ignore the strengths that go hand in hand with many brain differences. I've come to believe that I did not have a disability, as it is common to say, but experienced disability in environments that could not accommodate and embrace my differences." The dynamic and relational nature of misfitting provides a useful framework for understanding moral action and one form of moral injury, moral disempowerment. Moral action does not occur in a vacuum. Moral actions are actualized in environments that extend or stifle our moral impulses and efforts. And in cases where a moral environment persistently thwarts our moral action, despite our best efforts, these are cases of moral misfit, we experience a specific moral injury called moral disempowerment. So let me talk a little bit about moral injury and why it's a grave harm. Moral injuries occur when one performs or witnesses an act of moral transgression that acutely contradicts one's moral code and deeply undermines one's moral beliefs about oneself. It can be moral beliefs about oneself, moral beliefs about others in general, or moral beliefs about the world itself. These experiences lead to an intense inner conflict that Nancy Sherman has said can overwhelm one's sense of goodness and humanity. In moral injury, our beliefs about who we are and what the world is like are shaken in a way that is both comprehensive and profound. We might start to see ourselves as immoral, wonder if we are redeemable, or begin to see the world itself as a horrible place. In Afterwar, Nancy Sherman tells the story of Major Jeffrey Hall. During his deployment in Iraq, he was tasked with finding and making amends to surviving relatives of a civilian family that had been killed in the crossfire of a US attack. What the surviving relatives most wanted was the swift return of the bodies for burial. Hall's efforts to return the bodies were met at every turn with bureaucratic resistance. When the bodies were finally returned, they were rotted beyond recognition, and they were accompanied by death certificates that listed them as enemy combatants. Although Hall pushed back on the designations, the answer was no. They'd been designated enemies through bureaucratic laziness and error, and there would be no reversal. He also was ordered to pay an insulting amount of what's called solace money to the surviving family. And he recounts his experience. He says, in silence, he handed the uncle the envelope and watched as he counted the bills and then flung them to the ground. He says, "I deserve whatever this man does. If he slaps me in my face, I will take it. I will just take it." But the uncle just stood up, turned his back to Hall, and walked out of the room, the money still strewn on the floor. Hall knew that he had failed in his duties to the family, and he had failed in living up to his own moral standards. He was humiliated, betrayed by those in charge, and he felt impotent to do what he knew was right. It deeply undermined his sense of his own goodness. Major Hall experienced a kind of moral injury that Elisa Kars has called moral disempowerment. One is morally disempowered when one is trapped in a situation that acutely challenges one's own ability to sustain moral integrity despite one's best efforts to do what is right. We can now see how the concept of a misfit might apply to moral disempowerment. The moral injury of moral disempowerment can be described as occurring in situations of extreme moral misfit between moral agent and moral environment. When a moral agent meets an environment that fits their moral character, they are morally extended by an environment that supports their moral actions. However, an agent might also experience a misfit between their moral disposition and possibilities provided by the moral environment, just as a body and physical environment might meet a misfit. While the embodied misfitting can result in physical, political, or emotional harm, moral misfitting results in the moral injury of disempowerment, in which an agent cannot do what they deem moral, and they have no authority to change the environment in a way that would facilitate moral action. Having your moral actions thwarted occasionally won't seriously undermine one's moral integrity, but persistent misfits in which one can never succeed morally, or misfits that result in serious moral failure, like a single Sophie's Choice situation, can. When this happens, one experiences both a sense of failure for not living up to one's fundamental convictions and values, and a sense of frustration at being impeded in one's ability to be moral. In Major Hall's case, strict military command and the indifference or incompetence of those giving commands shaped the moral environment in a way that made it impossible to do what he felt and knew was right. But moral disempowerment is not restricted to service members, although that is where the literature on moral injury originates. Moral disempowerment can occur in any situation in which a moral agent and moral environment meet a misfit. Like embodied misfit, it is dynamic and inheres neither in the agent nor in the environment, but in the meeting of the two. It can arise or dissipate because of changes in the moral environment, changes in the agent, or both. The pandemic, for example, has exacerbated existing situations of moral misfit in healthcare and increased the prevalence and severity of moral disempowerment in the field. In an environment of chaos, in which doctors and nurses have had to make life and death decisions with inadequate time and information, deeply held beliefs and options considered inadequate or downright wrong come into conflict. One nurse described how this continual conflict made it feel as if she were going against her whole moral code. The harm that results from moral disempowerment is grave. Major Hall experienced severe near-suicidal post-traumatic stress. The moral effects of the pandemic on healthcare workers are still unfolding, but the early reports, both anecdotal and empirical, are quite grim. Guilt, shame, and anhedonia are all common responses. A defense attorney who worked in child protective services described her experience of moral disempowerment as resulting in, quote, a dulling of my joy. Once that curtain is pulled back and then shut over and over for me with so many people, it's hard to celebrate as innocently as I once did all of the great things happening in the world. Another member of the public defender's office put it more bluntly. The world is a horrible place. Moral disempowerment doesn't merely result in emotional pain. It suppresses a capacity to think of oneself as good or capable of goodness. It undermines one's sense of the world as worth living in. I've gone into a lot of detail about moral disempowerment and moral misfit because I wanted to dwell on the severity of the harm that results to make it plausible that one ought not knowingly inflict this kind of moral injury on another person or put them in a position in which moral disempowerment is likely to occur. So in this last section, I want to say why I think this provides a useful limit case for thinking about moral bioenhancements and the kinds of moral bioenhancements that would be morally permissible and the kinds that would be morally impermissible. Okay, moral misfit and moral bioenhancement, where everything is supposed to come together. Fabiano has recently argued that, quote, deep moral enhancement is relatively prone to unexpected consequences, end quote. He suggested the use of a safety framework for steering the development of moral bioenhancement. And I argue that one element of the safety framework must be sensitivity to issues of misfit and moral damage of the agent who undergoes the enhancement. The promise of moral bioenhancement is that it would make people more morally good and keep them that way, even in the face of environmental friction. Remember, the goal of moral bioenhancement isn't the creation of better moral doctrines, it's greater adherence to them in our moral actions and reactions, to keep us morally cool in our commitments, even in the heat of the moment. So in the face of annoyance, pragmatic considerations, lower communal norms that might give us an excuse to lower our own standards, bioenhancement could allow us to stay true to our moral selves by boosting the dispositional bases of our moral emotions and sensitivities, making us more attuned to and motivated by moral reasons and less acratic in our moral action. In this way, our moral capacities might come into better alignment with our cognitive abilities. This is the promise of moral bioenhancement, but for these very reasons, it also has the potential to cause harm to those who undergo it. Making one better attuned to what is morally salient and less able to turn off sensitivities to the environment will change the fit between a moral agent and the moral environment. What was once a coarse sensitivity to what is morally salient might become the fit of two finely tuned gears. We won't just know what the morally right thing to do is, we will feel it. We will be geared into it and gripped by the moral demands around us. And this on the whole might be a good thing. After all, I've just described what seems to be a better and tighter fit between agent and environment. However, being more closely aligned with the demands of an environment only results in better fit if it better enables you to do something in the environment. Fitting is about what you are able to do. There will be situations in which the grip of one's moral sensitivities is destructive, where slippage is what is required. And in situations where no amount of force can move the gears to action, where moral action, or at least moral action on all fronts, is impossible, the increased torque is only a liability. More force and more gearing in will only break the gear. In these cases, increased moral sensitivity and motivation doesn't result in greater fit, but greater misfit. Imagine the kinds of moral injuries that might result if a bioenhancement creates greater motivation and sensitivity to a moral environment that outstrips one's ability to successfully achieve what is demanded morally. Those of us who do not work in child protective services might know abstractly that bad things happen to children. It's very different to know the details, to have, as the public defender put it, the curtain pulled back and see it. A bioenhancement that increased our empathy for those we do not see, for future persons, and for non-human animals generally, would be a kind of pulling back of the curtain. One might develop an unrelenting awareness of the ongoing and actual emergency situation of the world that one is able to turn off or mitigate through action, thus suffering the moral injury of moral disempowerment. This should, and once one is aware of the dangers, can be avoided in moral bioenhancement. So in the very last part of this paper, I'll lay out a few guidelines and limits that I think are suggested by the dangers of moral misfitting and moral injury. Some moral bioenhancements are temporary and context specific. So although they might alter one's moral motivations enough to cause moral disempowerment and injury, right? So we shouldn't require or encourage ICU nurses to take a drug that might make them more sensitive and empathic. Course correction in cases that are kind of temporary and context specific allow for greater course correction. In cases where the use of morally enhancing pharmaceuticals causes or threatens to cause moral disempowerment, their use should be prohibited. And if signs of moral disempowerment related to enhancement are detected after a regimen of moral enhancement has begun, it should be ended. The framework of moral misfit here is instructive in two ways. First, it provides guidelines for those administering the drugs. They need to be on the lookout, not just for physical counterindicators, but moral ones. And second, because of the continued nature of these kinds of enhancements, one can expect greater oversight and therefore bolder advances might be attempted. So one might be able to push the envelope further with these kinds of temporary and context-specific enhancements than might be permissible in the kind of one and done moral interventions. The framework of moral misfitting also prescribes far more caution regarding bioenhancements achieved through genetic engineering, or which are permitted without further, or which are permanent without further intervention. These enhancements would remove the built-in brake that comes with ongoing administration. So ongoing administration of like morally altering drugs. And it also removes the inbuilt brake of close monitoring. It becomes less likely that the signs of moral injury would be detected and the appropriate remediations undergone. Having to perform a further intervention to reverse a prior bioenhancement is a high bar when compared with simply withdrawing a bioenhancing drug. So any intervention that would require this kind of reversal should be treated with extreme caution, especially given the difficulty of identifying early signs of moral injury. Special care should also be taken with genetic or permanent enhancements that will be resistant to environmental corrections. We should expect that genetic interventions would be fairly resistant to environmental correction. That's one of the chief benefits of this kind of intervention. However, it is also a risk factor for moral misfitting and thus moral injury. Our moral character will often adjust itself to our environment, especially when we are young. An intervention that aims to keep people at their very morally best in spite of environmental tensions should be treated with extreme caution. It is a primer for misfit because it suspends the very mechanism that eases the interaction of moral agent and environment and the way they shape each other. We must also be aware of the dangers of enhancing to moral capacities that are quite different from the general norms of the population in which the morally enhanced agent will live. One's own moral sensitivities and dispositions are exercised in a shared world of other moral agents with practical limits that are shaped by norms. Practical environments like physical environments are also shaped to accommodate the average. Moral environments will thus fit the most average moral impulses and inclinations. It's far easier to be a vegan in San Francisco than in central Pennsylvania, because in San Francisco, it is expected that a significant portion of the population will demand vegan accommodation. In restaurants, workplace cafeterias, and at private parties and get-togethers. So the environment is shaped to accommodate the demands of what is required by a large portion of those residing in the environment. A vegan can try to go it alone in central Pennsylvania, but they might be hungry and annoyed much of the time, which might make it harder to stay committed to their veganism. Similarly, climate justice is a collective problem. If you are the only one that feels the weight of the injustice and harm, you will feel the pull of the problem with few partners to execute morally required actions. Your moral action, perfectly reasonable in the context of willing collaborators, is impossible without. What one can generally expect of others is in fact part of the moral environment itself, at least in terms of whether or not one is morally extended or stifled. This must be part of the calibration of moral enhancement. It is important to note that the moral injuries described in this paragraph would happen even if the agent were enhanced within normal capacities, and not what Kahan and Savulescu call a supranormal enhancement. Moral capacities within the normal human range can result in environmental mismatch if, for example, one is engineered to be on the slightly above average side of empathy, but finds oneself in an environment of others who are all on the slightly below average side of empathy. There could plausibly be enough tension between oneself and others in that environment to create disempowerment. So a moral bioenhancement under these conditions would not be permissible. In general, we should be wary of interventions that create moral urges that agents would be unlikely to fulfill in a given environment. And all of the guidelines articulated above are specific instances of this general rule. There's a vulnerability to fit between moral agent and moral landscape. Being aware of this vulnerability just is a helpful means of navigating that. So there are a couple of consequences that I recognize will come from this. I've presented what I think is a useful tool to better guide the fine-tuning of moral bioenhancement. This kind of useful tool helps to highlight not just the need to fine-tune for the purposes of achieving the best moral outcomes, but fine-tuning with regard to the moral well-being of those undergoing enhancement. And I think this is an important contribution for three reasons. First, it offers a framework for thinking about the kind of moral bioenhancement that would be morally permissible. So this doesn't mean that we should aim for like easy moral fit with the environment, but rather keep in mind that moral environments in which agents find themselves have to be tolerable. So there has to be a tolerable moral fit. There has to be tolerable moral friction. Second, moral misfit is just the kind of hidden problem that is raised by some authors who work in moral bioenhancement. In Unfit for the Future, Person and Savulescu point out that our own current moral limits may warp the development of moral bioenhancement because we have an imperfect moral stance. But the perfect moral disposition, right? So from our imperfect moral stance today, how can we create the perfect moral disposition of the people of the future? So I think to not take into account the harms that misfitting might result in, that might result from moral bioenhancement would be to lean into a lack of empathy for future persons that we already know as part of a present moral flaw that we have. And finally, my consideration is not limited to the case of moral bioenhancement, but it holds for traditional forms of moral enhancement. So prohibitions regarding moral bioenhancement has revealed something about moral enhancement generally, even those traditional forms of it. We can make people, particularly children, too good for the world in which they find themselves and open them up to moral injuries that we do not intend. And I do think that this is a result of my argument, but it's one that can lead to some unintuitive consequences like, you shouldn't make your child too good if you know they're going to experience a kind of devastating moral misfit with the world around them. And so that's it. And I would love to answer some questions about this or hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you so much, Katherine. So I see that Seth has a question here, so I'm just going to read it out. He says, would the requirement not to enhance in cases that are likely to exhibit misfit be alleviated if there were further enhancements which increase tolerance for moral friction, since that tolerance is presumably dissociable from sensitivity to the moral situation given the success cases?
And this is a great proposal. So I take it that the idea is we could engage in these kind of radical enhancements if part of the enhancement is also to increase tolerance for it so that we wouldn't create moral damage. And already what you're doing in the suggestion is abiding by the framework of moral misfit to think about the ways in which we have to accommodate it. So yeah, that could be one way in which we advance morally through moral bioenhancement, but it would be a way that takes into account the kinds of worries that I've raised. Yeah, so I think that's a plausible response.
Great, thank you. So Raymond has a question as well. He says, thank you, this is so interesting, but I have to admit, hard to wrap my head around. Would you please speak more to your motivation to write this paper and perhaps some applied examples of your argument?
Mm-hmm. So why write this paper? There are a few whys here that could be in the back of your mind. One why is this sounds almost like science fiction at this point, that we're going to engage in moral bioenhancements. And it's so far down the road, and maybe it will never be a possibility. And that was a question that actually I had at the start of this project. Why even think about this? And the reason is, I think it's right that this does sound kind of like science fiction, that we would kind of use some gene editing tool in order to make ourselves, for example, less focused on the present and more sensitive to kind of future generations, and that this would be kind of just embedded in our genetic code, or moral sensitivities enhanced in this way. And right now, the kinds of empirical tests being done are pretty modest. So I mentioned one, it's the use of propranolol in certain contexts can reduce racial bias, but it's in a laboratory context. I think it might be a nasal spray. So it's very modest in terms of what it shows and what it does. And the other examples currently are also that modest. Using oxytocin to increase trust in, certain games within a laboratory setting. These all seem like, these aren't going to radically reshape us morally, and certainly they're not the kinds of interventions that would put us into the kinds of conflict with the environment that would result in moral disempowerment. But I still think that this is an important question because before there is this earnest development of moral bioenhancement, there should be robust and established frameworks to guide that development. And within bioethics, there is a real push for this development. So Persson and Savulescu, their work is meant to push people in this direction, saying, look at what we can do cognitively, look at what we can do technologically. If we don't immediately start instituting certain kinds of moral bioenhancements, this will lead in absolute devastation for the human race. So I think there are some pressures to start developing this. And my work is just to kind of offer a very small kind of worry about this. And so let me make sure that I've answered everything. Some applied it. I think I answered the question. My other motivation, it comes out right at the start, which is I have these worries about child rearing and the kinds of choices we make when we are raising our children. So beyond the scope of just moral bioenhancement, I have worries about the choices that we make in terms of making decisions for the people we are rearing and the kind of environment they will find themselves in as adults. So that's really a far in the background kind of consideration and motivation.
Great, thank you so much. Philip has asked, can moral disempowerment ever be morally enhancing? If so, is empowerment an adequate criterion for determining what is morally enhancing?
Can moral disempowerment? Okay. Let me say what I think. Let me build on this question and articulate what I think is in the background here. There's a sense in which experiences of moral injury and moral disempowerment might be really important in, our moral development as human beings. So that experiencing kind of the deep pain of having done something wrong and the trauma of it, we might have to have those experiences in order to develop and in order to kind of evolve morally. And as a community, there might be a need for kind of, like moral visionaries who experience deep moral injury, and that's part of what pushes us forward. And I think that could be right. And I'm interested in that possibility. And what I would say is that even if that's true, that moral injury could be important both at a personal level in moral development, and moral injury might be important at a communal level. My argument is just that there's still something wrong if you are the person that knowingly is creating those kinds of moral injuries. So that it's very limited. That I'm not saying we should eliminate all moral injury, but we certainly shouldn't be the agent instituting it or creating it.
Great, thank you. And Seth has a follow-up on Philip's question here. He says, do we lose something of value, something like the value of having one's morality shaped by one's particular situation or life history in the case of creating the phronimos, I don't know if I've pronounced that right, in the lab purely through genetic modification?
Good. So is this a question that's kind of more skeptical about the whole project, that we might lose something if we're doing this enhancement in the lab instead of organically. I don't know. So there are lots of philosophers who are very much opposed to moral bioenhancement on the grounds that they don't articulate exactly the worry that you raise, but the worry is that what you're doing is kind of eliminating part of our moral agency by tweaking us at a genetic level or introducing some like medical means of being moral or sticking to our moral guns. I'm a bit worried that in such case you might be forced to intentionally create. And maybe can I just say this? I don't know that I'm totally on board with the idea of moral bioenhancement. There are some good reasons to think that it is, we do lose something as moral agents if we engage in this. My take on this is just to point out that in addition to whatever other worries people have, this worry about harming people morally is certainly one that should be on the table.
Thank you. So it looks like Gennady had his hand up. So go on, Gennady, you can ask your question. For some reason, we can't seem to hear you, Gennady.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that. So thank you for an excellent talk. That was really wonderful. I have a point. It's not entirely original. I think David Sparrow says something similar. One might say that, you know, given the immense amount of injustice in the world, you know, given the exploitation, the inequality, colonialism, all that sort of stuff. One might make the argument, and I think you briefly touch on this, that we might say that we deserve to feel bad. In fact, we deserve to feel really, really bad about the things that are going on. And to the extent that your account suggests that maybe we should transform ourselves, not so that we feel really bad, because I think there's an argument to say, well, you know, you're an adult, you should feel bad for what you've done. We're going to make you feel bad for what you've done. Here you go. And someone might say that's morally right. So your account, like insofar as it tries to minimize the amount that we feel things, insofar as it tries to make us effective moral people, I guess, not necessarily moral agents, because what I'd like to push on is it seems that, you know, to the extent that you don't think people should feel for what's going on, and that should be minimized to make them effective, are you treating people more as moral instruments, as things to like achieve a certain moral goal, as opposed to specifically moral agents? Thank you.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you for that question. And I love this question. We deserve to feel bad because my thought is that there's a sense in which right now, my intuition is that we are in a state of crisis. We are in a state of moral emergency. And we are actually not feeling the fitting moral emotions. And so I think that any moral bioenhancement would be aimed at feeling the fitting moral emotions, what we should be feeling in response to, environmental devastation and, mass human suffering. And so insofar as I'm cautioning against enhancing to this point, it seems like I'm doing a thing where I'm saying, look, let's just not feel so bad. Let's, maybe let's be effective morally, because if moral injury is not just feeling uncomfortable morally. Moral injury is a kind of devastating response to your moral situation that undermines your ability to be a moral agent. It kind of targets your moral integrity. And so there's a kind of crumbling of you as a moral agent. So it's true that it's really, even if you're a consequentialist, it's not an effective state to have a moral agent in. But if it's the fitting moral emotion, maybe we should all feel it regardless. And it may be true that we ought to feel this way. But I also think that first, I don't want to minimize moral emotion. I don't think we should minimize it. We could enhance to a point where we feel a lot of pressure, where there's a lot of moral friction, and still not experience moral injury, which would be a kind of, it's like a stopping point of your moral agency. You just kind of give up. And so the test case, or kind of the limit, for me, is not feeling bad. Feeling bad is probably really good. It's moral injury in the true sense of being at a point where the world isn't worth living in. I can't be a good agent. Nobody around me is a good agent. And I'm suggesting that we don't create that in other people. And so even if objectively that's what we should be feeling, I'm saying we shouldn't be the agents that do that to another person, that there's something wrong with that.
Thank you. Sandra, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Your presentation was extremely, extremely interesting. I would regard myself as a moral misfit in the sense that I disagree on a very significant moral justice problem with most people I know. But I don't regard this as something terrible to be. I think that those folks that I rally with for climate action now, and those folks that are standing up to protect forests and mountains and other parts of the earth, we may regard them as misfits because they are people who are struggling against a majority. And it gets me to the other question I have for you. First of all, are you being too negative about what it's like to be a misfit? And because there's actually always something you can do. You may not win, but at least you can fight against the wrong or the injustice. But the other part is, what on earth can bio enhancement give us? I mean, are they going to give us beliefs? Are they going to give us values? Are they going to make us do moral reasoning better? The thing that scares me actually about the very notion is that they can make me a lot more compliant to the rules and the ones that are giving them. And no, thank you. I don't want that.
Yeah. Two very good questions. Thank you for those. Good. So for the first one, maybe moral misfitting isn't a bad thing. It's a great thing because it's what propels us forward. It's what gets people, right. It's what motivates people, even in the face of kind of indifference from others in their environment. It's calling those others to account is what moves us forward as a community. So we shouldn't avoid moral misfitting. And I agree with you. I don't think that we should avoid moral misfitting in all its forms. I think that moral misfitting is actually, you're right, it's a good thing. But what we should aim for is your kind of moral misfitting, where it's not devastating. It doesn't sound like moral injury. It sounds like the right level of moral friction, where you're at a point where you disagree with most people in your environment around you, and you're strongly committed to your kind of beliefs, and it motivates you, even though kind of there's friction because you don't have willing partners, around you, or you're always having to call people to account around you. But I think that's kind of what, if there's going to be an aim in moral bioenhancement, that has to be it. Something short of moral injury, something closer to just normal moral friction. And it could be long-term discomfort, but it's a step below kind of moral injury. And your second question is about what is involved in moral bioenhancement. And I think Person and Savulescu talk about this in their book, Unfit for the Future, that what we can't imagine in terms of moral bioenhancement is placing ideas in people's heads, that wouldn't be the kind of thing that is possible. So it wouldn't be about, it wouldn't be about specific moral values or moral commitments. It would be about tweaking the dispositions underlying our moral motivations. So our sensitivities, things that we can plausibly think motivate moral behavior, and increasing kind of how those operate or decreasing how those operate. So things like the very modest interventions that I mentioned are things like increasing trust in certain contexts might be important. In other contexts, it might be devastating, right? It might be the wrong moral thing. Or decreasing kind of in-group, out-group identifications. But they would be very specific things, not anything as robust as a specific moral value. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we're out of time. So I hope everybody will join me in thanking you for an excellent talk. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it, especially on the conversation about moral injury and disempowerment. I find that really cool. So thank you again. This has been Upon Moral and Genetic Stereotyping, a webinar put on by the Canadian Society for the the Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics. I thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.